cloud. Judges, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Steve Francis, retired political science professor from the U.S. Naval Academy. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm Candida Steele, and I'm retired as a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and I live in Maine.
I'm Lindsay Draper. I'm retired from the juvenile court bench here in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. And by the way, I've told everybody that I know Mr. Metesky and Mr. Scheck, all of you all, and how proud I am that you all are here.
And will you introduce yourselves?
We are Unit 6 juniors from Wauwatosa West High School, representing Wisconsin as state champions. I'm Carolyn Wolter. I'm Karina Pelzig.
I'm Zachary Nowacek. We are here on behalf of our mentors, teaching assistants, and teacher, Mr. Chad Metesky.
Well, thank you very much. We'll be using question number 1. In a letter to Daniel Shays, Benjamin Lincoln stated, "Disband your deluded followers. Should you attempt to fire upon the troops of the government, the consequences might be fatal to many of your men, the least guilty." What useful purpose, if any, have rebellions served throughout American history? Do the events of January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol constitute a rebellion? Why or why not? Are there rebellions in the world today that are justified? Why or why not? You may begin.
In U.S. v. Sinclair, Judge David J. Keith wrote that rebellions and insurrections are attempts of domestic organizations to attack and subvert the existing structure of government, where it can be found that the activity was or is carried on through unlawful means. By this definition, the events at the Capitol on January 6, 2021 constitute a rebellion. Domestic organizations such as the Proud Boys coordinated an attempt to halt the certification of electoral votes by Congress. One goal was to keep President Trump in office by, quote, stopping the steal and opposing the peaceful transfer of power. Over 150 other individuals have been charged with the obstruction of an official proceeding.
Rebellion and insurrection are classified as the same crime under 18 U.S.C.A. Section 2383, and as a result, January 6th is both. But calling it a rebellion, as a Wall Street Journal columnist suggests, could cast those who stormed the Capitol in a heroic light. Therefore, history should label the events of January 6th as an insurrection.
January 6th is one of the most recent American rebellions, but American history is replete with many others. Regardless of the merits of the rebellion's objectives, nearly all have proven useful in the development of America. The American Revolution is the most useful rebellion in our country's history. Without the rebellion against British rule, we wouldn't be our own nation. Because the colonists took up arms against their government, America became an independent democratic republic.
The Civil War is another instance of a useful rebellion, despite the fact that the Confederacy was fighting for the preservation of slavery. The war itself was useful as it preserved the Union and led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which sought to ensure equal rights to all citizens.
These conventional examples of rebellion encompass some, but not all rebellions. More broadly, rebellion could be viewed as open resistance to authority or tradition, as stated in Black's Law Dictionary, where open resistance must include unlawful means, as that is what demonstrates a rejection of the social contract. Accordingly, the civil rights movement was a rebellion that opposed tradition and authority to secure the natural rights of everyone. Unlawful actions were taken, such as Rosa Parks sitting at the front of a public bus, which violated Chapter 6, Section 11 of Alabama Code. Change came in the form of legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, which helped to end inequality.
Today, a continuation of the civil rights movement can be found in similar movements like the George Floyd protests of 2020. These protests are rebellions as the violence that took place was unlawful. These protests were justified because they were proportional to the unjust death of George Floyd and the inequalities still present in America today.
Internationally, the people of Myanmar, in response to the military coup of February 1st, 2021, have engaged in ongoing acts of rebellion. Mass demonstrations and labor strikes are justified in response to a government that no longer represents the people and has killed more than 1,500 protesters. The unlawful actions taking place constitute these protests as a rebellion. The Freedom Convoy, which started as a group of Canadian truckers protesting COVID-19 mandates, qualifies as a rebellion because they are defying authority and doing so unlawfully, as local police issued warnings of violence and property damage. It is justified because the protesters acted in proportion to a policy they felt violated their individual rights.
The bloody January protests in Kazakhstan were a result of rising oil prices that benefited government officials more than the citizens. The series of protests were originally peaceful and escalated only after police used violence that killed 206 civilians. Given that the government is not representative, the protesters were justified in their use of rebellion.
Thomas Jefferson held that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Rebellions, though they may seem destructive, often create more than they tear down, and are the foundations on which our country and much of our world is built. Thank you. This concludes our statement. We are now ready for follow-up.
Well, thank you. Put yourself in the position of the most violent of the demonstrators of January 6th and talk to us a little bit about how they might justify their behavior to their children and grandchildren.
They believed that they were subjected to a long train of abuses and usurpations, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. They believed that the election was stolen from them, and therefore they believed that they had the right to protest.
This belief that was held by many of the rioters, such as Dominic Pizzola, who was the leader of the Proud Boys, led them to in their eyes, a justified use of rebellion because they were no longer under a government that was upholding the social contract as laid out by John Locke, which would have allowed them to consent to their government.
Do you agree with them?
I do not agree with the protests on January 6th. The people that were protesting were not subjected to a long train of abuses as they might have believed, because they did not attempt other forms of protest before resorting to that violence. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King laid out certain steps of criteria, including negotiation and peaceful protests, which the rioters did not attempt when they believed the election was stolen.
Even if they did believe in something that was factually inaccurate, it is the case that they had been convinced by many unvirtuous representatives, such as President Donald Trump, who promoted that lie that the 2020 election was stolen. So although they may their actions were not justified as they did engage in violence, they were, it was understandable that they would do so, seeing as they believed that their government was being taken away from them.
Okay. Do you think that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has any application to the 1/6 events?
Under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, people can be barred from re-election, and we saw this on Friday when Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene was on trial for 3 hours in an attempt to allow her to continue to run in the next election.
This is not something that should be relevant in in discussing whether these representatives should be barred from Congress. It was found early after the Civil War when a individual from the South was attempted to be barred from being able to run for re-election, that in order to have that policy implemented and that amendment invoked, it would be necessary for Congress to pass legislation in order for that to be permissible, according to the Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
So if I want to go back for just a second to the events of January 6th and share with you a thought that after getting caught having tried to subvert an election, people who basically were just poor losers and weren't prepared to accept it tried to blame it on something like, oh, it was being stolen. That was the same kind of thing that as a child, I used to say, oh, but my sister is the one who did it. They'd blame it on something that really you knew wasn't true. Does that constitute a good enough excuse for saying, even if we were wrong, we did it for legitimate reasons?
It does not constitute a good enough excuse. A good excuse would be that people are dying or starving, like the excuse was for the French Revolution. People were going off baseless claims that the election was stolen that were not true.
I agree with my colleague. However, whenever there is a transfer of power, there is always some protest against it. For example, in 2016, when President Trump was elected, there was protest against his election. And because our country is so polarized, no matter what happens, each side is going to blame the other.
If I could just add one thing, isn't what we always talk about as American exceptionalism, the fact that if there is a transfer of power, even if it's to the people we didn't like, we accept the will of the people?
Yes, and it was incredibly important right at the beginning of the founding in the election of 1800, where there was one of the first peaceful transfers of power in the history of our world, and seeing that that the government completely shifted, despite the fact that like never in any other time in our history would we have seen something like that happen, given the monarchies and other governments in our world at that time.
Additionally, voting is extremely important because it can be used before resorting to those acts of rebellion. So they should be using that to peacefully choose who they want to be in power instead of resorting to violence right away.
Thank you.
Would you clarify again your distinction between resurrection and insurrection?
I mean, rebellion and insurrection.
Or excuse me, rebellion and insurrection.
Insurrection is much more extreme than rebellion. An example of this would be the Wilmington insurrection. Many more people died compared to a rebellion where people typically have a set out on train of abuses, and it is slightly less violent.
The two are very similar as they are classified legally as the same thing under Section 2383 of US Code. However, there is semantical differences in between the two. We can see that in pop culture, rebellion is seen as much more of a good thing. This can be seen in Star Wars and other such pop culture books and movies. And so the difference between the two can be found in the connotations that society sees between the two.
When, if ever, should freedom of speech or assembly be limited?
Freedom of assembly was determined in Cox v. New Hampshire can be limited by time, place, and manner. And we have seen this in our hometown of Wauwatosa during the Black Lives Matter protests. There was a curfew given during these violent protests.
Freedom of assembly should also be limited if it impacts other people's rights, and that goes for all of the other 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. An example of this would be the Black Lives Matter in our hometown of Wauwatosa. Those protests had the National Guard called in because they wanted to protect the lives of the citizens living in our town.
In Ward v. Rock Against Racism, it was determined that as long as restrictions allowed for other ways for protesters and those seeking to use their First Amendment rights, they laid out that the policies had to be content neutral, that they had to be specifically tailored to allow for other forms of communication, to use that communication in other ways as well.
Freedom of speech should not be limited by the government. However, it is limited by private corporations, and we can see this through Twitter banning certain government officials such as President Trump from their platforms.
How can one alter or change government without rebellion or insurrection?
It can be used with civic engagement, which can be and compromise between individuals and parties. This was seen in the doorman protests just this last week in NYC, which would have led to 30,000 doormen going on strike. However, because of compromise between them and the Realty Board, they did not go on strike, which was effective instead of the protest, which would have come next.
Additionally, as MLK put it, an unjust law is no law at all. So therefore, civil disobedience can be used to subvert a law that people don't agree with. And we can see this with the Greensboro sit-ins or even the New York City draft riots when they burn their draft cards.
MLK also said violence never brings permanent peace. So for permanent legislation like the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, it's necessary to use peaceful tactics in order to gain the support of the majority of people.
It's been interesting listening to you make reference to the National Guard, because the one thing that keeps coming to mind is right before the January 6th protests in DC, there had been Black Lives Matter marches, which were much more heavily policed. And I guess what I'm asking you to talk to me about is, within a minute, how does the nature of the protest dictate whether or not it's an effective, and the people doing the protesting, whether it's an effective remedy. How do I get an answer to my problem if government's going to respond differently?
One way that governments respond that can greatly influence the effectiveness of a protest is whether the government is using violence against peaceful protesters. This was seen in Tiananmen Square in China when a lot of violence was used against those peaceful protesters, and it turned a lot of that country and the whole world against that government.
Okay. So how do you think events such as those that took place on January 6th can be prevented?
Oh,
Saved by the bell.
Saved by the bell.
It's a good answer.
Good, yeah, good job.
Congratulations.
Yeah, good job. You had good historical background, which I found was very helpful. It was helpful when you defined your terms and clarified those. The Jefferson quote was useful, for setting up the parameters of rebellion. You had some repetition, but I think that was because of our questions, not in terms of your presentation. I would like you to spell out a little bit more things like constitutional amendments and other sorts of procedures that might be used to change government. But overall, you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Great. Lindsay? Or would you like to go
Well,
last?
No, okay, no, I'll go ahead. Couple of things jumped out at me because I don't know that I've heard a whole bunch of people talk about the administrative code in giving these answers, and people often forget what a huge part of law the USCA is, and so that jumped out at me. I was really pleased to hear that. It would be virtually impossible to answer questions like this without references to the civil rights movement. That's kind of the big one that we sort of assume we'll hear. You made my heart beat happy with the reference to the Proud Boys. And part of the reason is sometimes it is a whole lot easier to not acknowledge some problems that we've got and to just sort of act like everything is, one-sided and that's where the violence comes from, when really it comes from a lot of places. You did real well with that. I liked a number of your references. I wanted to talk to you about Tiananmen Square. I got quiet because I had dominated a lot of the conversation there, but I wanted to talk to you about how the world may have gotten really unhappy with China, but I think China is just rolling right along right now, and I don't know that that a whole lot got accomplished. Anyway, I have more than once said how proud I am to be from Wauwatosa and to have the association that I do with the school, and you have done nothing to change that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very good. Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation. Very nicely done. It's always nice to learn new things. I was very happy that you brought in the trucker rebellion. Was an interesting thing to bring up. It just having happened, and the doorman strikes. I don't know. You're sending me home to do homework, as Lindsay would say. You did a really nice job, and I hope you've enjoyed this experience. I hope it's been more for you than you expected it would be. That it has inspired you more to keep a handle on what's going on, to keep studying what's happening, and be good citizens and go out and vote, of course, but that you'll also talk to your friends and colleagues and encourage them to become interested and involved. And I'm hoping that in some fashion or another, you might find yourselves representing the rest of us in state or local governments or federal, even if you're interested, or as a non-elected employee. Government employees need to be just as well educated as the representatives. So I'm looking forward to hearing that your generation has taken over from ours, and I'll sleep better at night. So thank you. You've made me feel much better about my future. I hope you had a good time. Cheers.